Hello again, wrestling fans, and welcome to a brand new edition of the Good Friends, Better Enemies podcast. This week, we are joined by Maddie Daddy of Maddie Daddy Presents as we bring to you a combined effort of BRET Hitman Hart, the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels, the Rivalry. We're going to take you all the way back to the beginning through until the Montreal Screwjob. We're talking tag team championships, Intercontinental Championships, WWF Championships, and all things in between. We're talking friendship turned into bitter rivalry. We're talking about all the things going on in the company at the time, from the start all the way through to the finish. We can't wait for you to listen this week and hear what we've put together for you, a fun conversation we recorded earlier this week, and it's right here, right now, on the Good Friends, Better Enemies podcast. Don't forget to check out www.countitout7.com, the Countitout7 YouTube page, Classic Match Classroom, as well as our Instagram at good_enemies, as well as Twitter at good_enemies. And buckle up, folks, because you are in for a humdinger, and you are listening to the Good Friends, Better Enemies podcast.
All right, Jay, how the hell are you, man? Welcome to the show. Let's get going.
What is going on, Maddie Daddy? Good to talk to you. It's been a dog's age.
Absolutely, man. Last time we were talking wrestling, we were covering, Toronto Skydome Monday Night Raw. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. Yeah, we had a great time going over that. I was at that show, and it was all the feels, all the nostalgia. So we're going right back into that time frame, hurtling towards this rivalry we're going to be talking about today. I am pumped to talk about this.
Absolutely. Last time we left off, we were kind of watching this taped Raw that was just crazy, but you started seeing the pieces fall for BRET the Hitman Hart and the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels, and just kind of this rivalry. So I thought what we'd do today, we're combining shows, the power couple here, hitting it hard, hitting it fast. Let's talk Bret Hart, his peak run, a little bit of tag team, but really that IC run, that WWF title run, and how that kind of compared to Shawn Michaels. And end of the day, how are we judging these guys? Which ones may be a little better than the other, or they just kind of go hand in hand? Let's get it, Jay.
100%. Let's get into it, man.
Tag team wrestling. You know what that is? That's chemistry. That's a connection. That's gold. Both these guys started around 1985. So these guys were wrestling from a young age, and they're both stuck in tag teams, from Bret Hart in the Stu Hart dungeon to Shawn Michaels, wrestling with Jose Lothario into the Rockers. Kind of fill us in on anybody who's under a rock, kind of Bret Hart and the Hart Foundation.
Well, I think that you hit the nail right on the head with that. I mean, Bret Hart started his career in Calgary for Father Stu Hart's Stampede Wrestling promotion, the 8th of 12 children. He began his career there in Calgary and moved on shortly after there to the WWF. In 1984, Stu Hart sold Stampede Wrestling to Vince McMahon. And so Bret, along with Jim Neidhart, went out to the WWF to prosper and grow in that territory. Really weren't doing a whole bunch at that time. And eventually, Bret Hart was offered a gimmick of Cowboy Bret Hart, where they actually wanted to have him come out to the ring on a horse and wear a cowboy hat and studs and boots and the whole 9 yards. And he was sort of nonplussed about the idea. So from there, he offered the suggestion of, why don't you team me up with Jim Neidhart, give us Jimmy Hart, and call us the Hart Foundation. And the rest was history. I mean, one of the greatest tag teams of all time, one of the most decorated, and certainly got to be in anybody's top, I would say, 3 tag teams of all time.
Absolutely. And you think of like the late 80s, kind of early 90s, tag team wrestling was the kitty's titties, man. You had Demolition, the Road Warriors, Arn and Tully, all these tag teams that were just something you kind of missed out on as the 90s went on, and even today. So tag team wrestling, man, I don't want to go into it too deep, but this team of Anvil and Hart, it just seemed like you had your speed, your technical ability, and then you had just this larger than life, brute powerhouse in Anvil.
Oh, 100%. And that's what made the team click. I think, you had the powerhouse, as you alluded to, with Jim Neidhart, and then, of course, Bret Hart with the technical skill and some aerial offense as well. I mean, you look at the tag team division at the time, like you said, you had the Bulldogs, you had the Killer Bees, you had Demolition, you had the Brainbusters for a time, you had the Islanders, all these incredible teams that were coming up, and you'd get this outstanding tag team offense. I mean, a lot of times on house shows back in the day, Hogan would go on before intermission, and the closing match of the night would be a tag team attraction. I think we got a taste of that tag team division again at the height of the Attitude Era. We had a really, really solid tag team division, but really since then, it's kind of fallen off. So, I mean, you have tag teams coming in all throughout the 80s that are making an impact, just like in 1988, when a certain other tag team made their debut in the WWF.
That's right, baby. Can't talk tag team wrestling without talking Marty Jannetty and the Rockers. We saw them in the AWA, CSW, kind of all over the place, but they make an appearance in WWF. But their first one is a pretty short appearance. It's like a day, if I'm correct. Just party animals.
Yeah, I think it was in Buffalo, New York, if I'm not mistaken. And Jimmy Jack Funk told this story about how Shawn was causing a big ruckus with Marty in the bar. And I guess the story goes that in actuality, Jimmy Jack was chewing on his glass and calling out the Rockers for being partiers. So as it goes in the wrestling business, telephone, telegraph, telewrestler, to coin a phrase. And shortly thereafter, they were future endeavored.
They make their way back into the business. No gold, though, where the Hart Foundation, Anvil and Hart, had 2 wins as a tag team champions, but there is that special Saturday night's main event. Everybody remembers because they don't remember it. The Rockers beat the Hart Foundation, but the ropes break.
Yeah, 100%. The rope breaks. It was a pre-tape match, so all the competitors in the match were trying to explain to a referee who was evidently deer in headlights, this is taped. Let's just stop the match and fix the turnbuckle and restart it. It's not a big deal. But for whatever reason, they continued on with no top rope. The Rockers had this incredibly anticlimactic win for the tag titles. And then from there, the match is erased from history, and the Hart Foundation goes on as your World Wrestling Federation tag team champions.
That's right. So let's kind of move it forward, though, because we have a lot to talk about. Let's kind of talk IC runs, and then let's talk about the characters of these two guys, because they are polar opposites, and it's just intriguing how this run kind of ends. But let's go IC champ. You get Bret Hart breaking away here right around the same time Shawn Michaels does in 91. And you get Hart lined up with match after match, just putting on clinics from an early start. Talk to us about Bret's IC run.
Well, it's funny because they tried Bret with a singles run in 89, and he had a couple of months there. I think the better part of 89, he was a singles competitor, and then he was brought back together with Jim Neidhart. They put him back into a singles space after WrestleMania 7, and that's when his ascent to the singles ranks really started. You could see Bret, as you said, starting to have these incredible singles matches, having these clinics, and eventually being paired up with Mr. Perfect, Kurt Hennig, at SummerSlam 1991 in a classic match. Of course, Bret Hart goes over, wins the Intercontinental Championship, and then from there, he takes on all comers, going up against the likes of Rowdy Roddy Piper, the Mountie, the Berserker, all sorts of colorful characters from that time period. But man, did he ever put on some incredible matches in this time frame, all the way going up until, of course, the infamous SummerSlam in 1992.
Absolutely. And I think a thing to look at when you're looking at Bret Hart in 1991 and you're looking at Shawn Michaels, these guys are separated by 8 years of age. So maybe where Bret Hart was in 91, you look back at the body of work and you got to realize he was, 35 at the time, 34. So he's peak, like you're in your peak performance. He's already paved the way quite a bit, where you have Shawn Michaels, 26, 27, just different mindset in 1991.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with that. But I do have to say, as I've gotten older, and I don't know if this is because I'm getting close to 40 myself, but I've started to realize that a lot of these wrestlers, their peak and their prime is closer to 40. I mean, you look at even these two guys, I mean, Bret, one of his best years, arguably his best year was 97. Shawn was never better when he came back in 2002. So, and you look at the current roster today, I mean, there's a lot of guys north of 40 or sailing around that particular age bracket that are doing their best work. So I think that these years that we're talking about right now with Bret and Shawn were the building blocks to get them to their peak and their prime.
So let's talk a little bit about this, because 1992, there's the first ever ladder match in WWE history. And it's none other than Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels stealing the show, literally a year removed from being tag team wrestlers. What's that say about these guys' trajectory towards the top?
I think it indicates that there's confidence in the company that these guys can go out and really perform at a high level. I mean, clearly the evidence was written on the wall that these two guys were going to be the workhorses. Of course, the Intercontinental Championship at this time was the workhorse title. Everybody knows that. I know you can look at the history of the Intercontinental Championship at this time, and the list of people that held it is really a who's who of the wrestling business in terms of work rate. So when you go from that perspective, I mean, I think that it was pretty clear that these guys were becoming established as single stars, and there was no better evidence of that than this ladder match.
When we're also talking about Hulk Hogan, Ultimate Warrior, Psycho Sid, just these different guys that are larger than life. These are bodies. These aren't necessarily going to put on a match that's going to be an Iron Man match or a ladder match. So you're seeing a time where Intercontinental Championship is your working rate. Like you said, kind of with the tag team match closing the show, you'd have Hogan and, Warrior fighting at the top, but you had matches like HBK and Hart underneath stealing the show.
100%, 100%. And I mean, once we get past the Barber Shop in January of 1992, all bets are off for Shawn.
Let's kind of talk briefly on that as well, because I'd say that's one of the most, significant. I put it up there. I can think the Shield maybe is another one, but I'd say the Barber Shop is that made him what he is today. That iconic moment kind of paved the way for his singles run.
Yeah, I think that the Barber Shop still to this day is maybe the most impactful tag team breakup in history. I think the thing that really made it impactful, especially in 92, was the fact that it was so graphic. I mean, you have to look at the WWF in 92. It was kind of a juxtaposed on itself. You had moments where you had Jake Roberts, attacking Randy Savage with a Cobra and biting Savage's arm, but then you'd have, the gobbledygooker as well on the roster. And then of course now you have this breakup here with Shawn throwing Marty through the glass. I mean, it was just such a shocking moment, and it's endured for 30 years.
Absolutely. And we kind of paved the way for the new generation, as you say, because you see these guys working their asses off. They even have a Survivor Series 1992 match, world title match that Bret Hart wins, but you can tell they're trusting Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart enough that they're putting them in the main event of a Big Four pay-per-view.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, at this time as well, you have to remember that the WWF is embroiled in a number of scandals. The steroid scandal was also starting to come to the surface at this point. So it made sense from an optics standpoint to put Bret Hart as your champion because he was clean. He was a smaller guy. He wasn't jacked up. And he could also perform to a level that would satisfy an audience looking for a main event performance. Same thing with Shawn.
Yeah. So I think that's where we need to kind of get to, because we are heading towards 93. Here we see Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart. They're kind of on that same trajectory. I'd say Bret's probably a little bit more polished performer. You've kind of seen what he's done in the past. But we're heading to the world title, man, because like you said, we have Hogan, all those guys kind of leaving. So that puts post-steroid era, a lot of these younger, littler guys, to say the least, in the main event spotlight. And it's Bret Hart, baby. 1992, you get the Ric Flair Royal Rumble win with a tear in my eye. Woo, woo, woo. Jake, can you give me a woo, baby?
Woo!
Woo! He does a hell of a Howard Finkel, by the way. We'll get to that later. But you get Bret Hart beating Ric Flair for the title. I believe it was at a house show. Am I correct?
It was at a wrestling challenge taping, I believe, in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan in October of 1992.
What is going on there? What kind of booking is that?
I don't know. From what I've heard, and I mean, I don't know, 100%. My understanding is that Flair was suffering from vertigo, which was inhibiting his ability to perform, and he wasn't able to really perform at the level that he wanted to. So they decided to make the switch and put the title on Bret. I think it was kind of decided shortly after the main event of SummerSlam 92, where Bret dropped the Intercontinental title to the British Bulldog. And Bret has gone on record to say that he felt that although Bulldog won that match, it was kind of Bret's defining moment at that time in his career.
So let's talk about Bret Hart's title run here, at least this early run, because we still have, Shawn Michaels still in this IC run, but this is 93, 92, man. This is a big deal for Bret Hart, for a guy who takes, he's a no-nonsense wrestler. He's got morals. He lives the character. This is him in real life. So what do you think, being, like we talked earlier, the youngest of 8 in Stu Hart's dungeon, hitting that pinnacle where you're the world champion? What does that say to him that he's made it? What do you think was going through his mind going from Hogan to Hart, right then and there?
Well, I think that the company needed to make a pivot at this point. And I think that you couldn't really continue on going to that formula that had worked so well in the 80s with the Hogans, with the Warriors, and performers of that nature. I think that at this point, the audience had evolved to a point where they were looking for something more. And that's something that you'll see continuously throughout our talking about these two performers, is they're constantly evolving and changing their performances. They're refining their skills constantly, because the company as a whole was peaked. It had hit a peak. It had hit a crescendo. We weren't seeing the kind of returns on Hogan even at this point that we had a couple of years earlier. So I think that at this point, I don't know who else on the roster could have picked up the mantle the way that Bret Hart did. I don't know if there's anybody else that was on the roster at this time with the kind of momentum that Bret had that could have filled that spot that really belonged to Hogan for so long. So, I mean, what do you think, Matty? Do you think that anybody else on that roster off the top of your head could have carried the championship at that time?
In 92, 93, probably not off the top of my head. I mean, we kind of saw it with Savage in the past, Flair. So it was time for somebody new. And a lot of people don't realize how over Bret Hart was in 92, 93 outside of the United States. Like, you go to Britain, you go to London, anywhere, Africa, this guy's getting louder cheers than Hogan or anybody else on the roster.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, here in Canada as well, I'm recording here in the Greater Toronto area, so I'm very well acquainted with the fandom of the Hitman and the Hart family. So he was a worldwide superstar even before he got the opportunity with the championship, the WWF championship, that is. He was so over in those countries at that point already that I think it made logical sense. But meanwhile, back at the ranch, we have Shawn Michaels defending the Intercontinental Championship and putting on clinics of his own.
Absolutely. His early work, you can kind of see him developing his character. And I think that was huge for Shawn Michaels, because he is 8 years younger, so he is having to work out the kinks and kind of develop into that showstopper, that icon. And I think the 93, 94 era was kind of where he started to really make a name for himself, whether it was with Bulldog in 92 or as he kept going, as we'll talk down the road with Razor, with Owen, with these other big time feuds, or even turning on his bodyguard Diesel. He makes a name for himself as a worker. And that's what we've kind of keep going back to. The IC champion is the guy who's putting in the work. But at this point, you have two workers that are probably the best in the business, with Shawn Michaels as the IC champ, Bret Hart as the heavyweight champ. So it's kind of, we're on that track. We're running to what we're about to get to here shortly. But Shawn in 93, 94, you kind of see him struggle kind of with his demons of his own, things that you don't usually see with Bret Hart start popping up with Shawn Michaels, whether it's the steroid thing where he's accused of failing a drug test or getting kind of mouthy with the owner, things you didn't see in old time wrestling for the most part from your IC guy. That you might get it from your heavyweight champ, but at an early age, you're seeing Shawn Michaels, cockiness, his flamboyant, not taking shit from anybody.
Yeah, 100%. I remember hearing a story that Shawn told about how he was at a TV one day back when Hogan and Savage were still top dogs, and he was waiting in line to talk to Vince, and the line was, an hour long. And of course, by the time he would have gotten his turn, he wouldn't have had time to speak to Vince anymore. And so I guess Shawn just cut the line in front of Hogan and Savage and went right into the dressing room with Vince and had a conversation and said something to the effect of, what do I need to do to get to the level of the main event with the rest of these guys? And Vince said something to the effect of, well, you just did it. So, I mean, Shawn had that innate streak inside himself all the time, that self-assured, I guess, cockiness to an extent, maybe not so much at this point, but at this point you could really see that he had a lot of faith in his own skills, that he had the ability. And I think there was some frustration on his end, and probably Bret's to an extent as well, that they had the ability to steal the show, but they weren't being afforded the opportunities because of the bigger stars of the past.
Well, let's pivot back, because let's talk Bret Hart's first WrestleMania as champ. It's WrestleMania 9. You've just seen Yokozuna win the Royal Rumble. And how does this end? We have Hogan walking out as champion. We get the, you think Yoko's going to beat Bret, but what do you think's going through Bret's mind here? Because we're in 93. He loses to Yoko with, kind of a mishmash finish with the salt in the eyes. So whatever. You'd think they're building a return, but you have Hogan come in at the end, steal the show, and he's your world champ. What does that say? What is Bret Hart probably thinking at the moment?
I think, I can't speak for Bret, obviously, but I think in hindsight, everybody agrees it was a misstep.
Right.
I think
Do you think that's where the saltiness that we kind of, it almost seems like it's paved the way, but I think this might be the first kink in the armor.
Okay, so this is an interesting question. This is something I wanted to ask you that has to do with Bret and not necessarily Shawn. Why do you think that we never got Hogan and Bret? Because in my mind, it's probably maybe the top 2 or 3 matches for me as personally as a fan that we never got to see on a big time stage, that I'm very disappointed we never got to see.
I think it comes down to Hogan not wanting to lose to Bret. I think Hogan was used to losing to these big guys, whether it be Earthquake or whether it be, Warrior, or you saw his feuds he had with King Kong Bundy. Bundy, you're robbing them blind. Anyways, these big guys, and you kind of see it transition over into WCW after Hogan leaves. I just don't think Hogan thought it was believable for him to lose to a smaller wrestler.
Yeah, it's funny because you hear about all of these different ideas of what was happening in 93. I mean, according to Bret, and I think it's been substantiated, that they even did, a photo shoot on a beach with the two of them having a tug of war for the championship, presumably for SummerSlam 93. And obviously that never came to fruition. But for me, I mean, I just think it's such a lost opportunity to not see Bret and Hogan in a match on a big time stage. I mean, whether you do it at WrestleMania 9 or you do it at SummerSlam, or even, Hogan wasn't signed to WCW at that point. You could have even done it at WrestleMania 10, which would have been amazing to do it there. But I don't know. I just wanted to get your take on it because I'm just so curious and fascinated by that relationship.
Yeah, I think Hogan was just his own biggest fan. And I think Vince McMahon didn't help that because he let Hogan do. Granted, you put millions of dollars into this guy in the 80s, and he's your biggest star. He's pretty much the foundation for wrestling. So I get it. But I think there was a lot of, I wouldn't say jealousy, but there was, it's post-steroids. We got to move on from Hogan. That's kind of what everybody saw. The act was getting stale. So you have to pivot to somebody else. You have to keep it going. And I don't think Hogan wanted to be, he felt like it was disrespectful because I think he still saw himself, as the largest wrestling icon in the world at the time. And Brett, you're the guy going on all these road, all these houses, traveling every day of the year. You're not doing what Hogan does. Hogan's got his own, he's pampered. Believe it or not, he got what he wanted. But you see the working man, nobody probably did more house shows, traveled more than Bret Hart did from 85 to 97.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, the thing about it too is if you look at Bret Hart's first title run here in 92, other than beating Flair for the championship, he really wasn't set up in a way that he was launched correctly as a champion. I mean, you had him going over against some younger stars like a Razor Ramon, like a Shawn Michaels, which is all well and good. But ultimately, they still had stars on the roster that he could have gone over, like a Warrior at one point, potentially before he left in November for Survivor Series. You could have had him go over against Flair again. You could have had him go over against Hogan, against Savage. All these guys were available to really blast Bret Hart's championship reign into the stratosphere. But he never had the opportunity to really establish himself by going over the previous generation's talent.
Well, and that's another. Now I'm going to pivot back to you, Jay, because in ring, we talk Shawn Michaels. We'll get more to him because his run's a little bit more heavy later. But bell to bell, Bret Hart tells stories. So do you think it was because he could literally wrestle a broomstick and have a great match that maybe, Vince just didn't want to deal with egos at the time? Or what was it that kept Bret away from these matches we saw in his IC run against Perfect, Piper, just these fantasy booking, as you'd say. And now we're kind of, we're getting guys we don't want to see. Your Hakushis, your John Pierre Lafayette's, Jerry Lawler's, nothing against them, but it's not the same as your Hogan run or your Warrior. He's not being force-fed superstars.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think at a certain point, maybe it was like we talked about, they were trying to pivot away from certain stars. But I mean, I think Savage is a great example. Actually, we rebooked on our show WrestleMania 9 not too long ago during WrestleMania season. And we had rebooked the main event of WrestleMania 9 as Bret Hart versus Randy Savage. And of course, Bret Hart going over and winning the championship. And that would have been like the crowning achievement of Bret's title reign at the time, is going over someone like Savage. Nothing against Yokozuna. I mean, I'm fine with Yokozuna as a champion, but at the same time, he'd only been in the company for about, 4, 5, 6 months at the time. So I think we could have held off on Yoko and had him go off against someone else. And it really established Bret's title run at WrestleMania 9 as opposed to cutting it short.
Man, have you seen some of those matches of Yokozuna's in 93, 94? Just how agile he is?
Oh, he's incredible. He's like a cat.
And we're talking about like a 500-pound guy or something crazy.
Yeah, 100%.
So we're on the path to WrestleMania 10 here, man. And that's kind of, we see the whole funny business with Hogan. Hogan doesn't want to do business for Hart, but then he drops the belt to Yokozuna at King of the Ring. So what does that do? Puts Yoko back as champ. Bret's got to work his way back up. We also get kind of a little bit of Lex Luger. So you've got to be thinking, if you're Bret Hart, you're on your way to WrestleMania 10, but we've got the Lex Express. We've got Hogan 2.0, basically, right?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, I think that's another thing we've discussed in previous episodes as well on our show is talking about how you go all the way with Lex, the way they did with the Lex Express, and then you don't pull the trigger and you don't even try putting the title on him, I think was a head scratcher for a lot of people. I mean, you could have put it on him at SummerSlam. If it doesn't work, take it off at Survivor Series. You'd have a couple of months to figure it out. But at this time with Bret, I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up King of the Ring 1993. It was arguably Bret's finest hour. I mean, you see him go up and wrestle 3 matches against 3 different competitors. You have him go up against Razor,
Bigelow, and what am I missing here? No,
it was Razor. He went up against Razor, and then he went up against Perfect, and then he beat Bigelow. But if you watch that King of the Ring 93 match with Perfect, it's arguably Bret's greatest match. I mean, it was an outstanding match, bell to bell. Again, telling stories, and certainly, in my opinion, the best match that Perfect and Bret ever had.
When you got to think about Perfect's back injury, that happened in 91, 92. So Bret probably had to carry quite a bit of that match. And you're talking about a guy who wrestled 3 times that night.
Yeah. And every match was different. Each match told a different story. You had the powerhouse with Scott Hall, Razor Ramon. You had the technical match with Mr. Perfect, Kurt Hennig. And then, of course, with Bam Bam, you have the classic, David versus Goliath story. I mean, each match was different. Each match was beautiful in its own way. And it really, really paved the way for, again, showcasing Bret's talents, working with different types of competitors and telling stories that fit the characters and the dynamics between the two.
Absolutely, dude. And I think that's something anybody can go watch a Bret Hart match, and you cannot tell me bell to bell anybody can put on a better story. We're talking move for move. Doesn't matter if he's selling moves or if he's doing them or have the strategy of working a body part. Nobody does it better than the Hitman.
No, nobody. And for that matter right there, I mean, talking about working a body part, I mean, you see a lot of times that you tell the story in a match, okay, someone tweaks their knee, and then you work the knee, but then you start working the head, and then you start working the arm. Bret would work the body parts every match. He would work the leg, he'd work the back, because you could see it as the match unfolded. He's working for the sharpshooter. He's working to wear down his opponent so he can get that submission. And he didn't go about it the same way every single match. I mean, sure, he had the second rope elbow. He had the Russian leg sweep. He had the backbreaker. He had those signature maneuvers that every wrestler has in their repertoire. But for Bret, he was a master at finding creative ways of getting to tell that story, getting to break down his opponent.
I think one of my favorite things that Bret Hart did is when he'd sell running into a turnbuckle.
Yeah.
You hear it, you feel it, you literally think Bret Hart killed himself. That's how
sternum first, right into the turnbuckle.
Oh
yeah, it was incredible.
And he would sell it, and then and he didn't always have to win with the sharpshooter. He'd do a roll up. He'd do different things to end the match. But to get to the sharpshooter was also another level. It was just a story, your final chapter. But I want to go to WrestleMania 10, man, because this is when these guys, you can kind of see one's an IC champ, one's a world champ. And I think this is kind of where Shawn Michaels elevates himself to get into that picture with Bret Hart. So let's talk WrestleMania 10, because we get Bret Hart versus Owen Hart. And it's such a story. It's such a good match. Owen Hart with the upset win over Bret Hart. And then, as we said, Yokozuna, Bret Hart into the night. That's who you get. You get Bret Hart winning the Rumble, co-tied with Lex Luger. The buildup of Lex Luger, Vince is still going with his guy at the end of the night with Bret Hart. So we've seen Bret Hart's kind of main event run be kind of wishy-washy. He's been the guy, but does the company fully trust him as the guy, even though he's their workhorse?
Yeah, and then on the other hand, you have the coming out party for Shawn Michaels, arguably. People still talk about it this day as the greatest ladder match in history. Razor Ramon and Shawn Michaels. So both men had a very successful evening. I would be very curious to see where you land on this. Out of the two matches, which do you prefer? Do you prefer the ladder match or Bret and Owen?
Yeah, it's the ladder match. I think what it did for Shawn Michaels as a superstar to elevate him into that next tier. And that's what I was looking for with Shawn Michaels. And I'm not sure you found that, but with the story of him getting suspended and taking the IC title, and then you get your first ever ladder match at WrestleMania 10, and you have Razor winning, but Shawn stealing the show. And then you hear this next layer of this rivalry where Bret Hart claims that HBK stole spots that they used in the first ladder match. And it's like, come on, Bret, like, this is where we're going with this. You know what I mean? You're almost in my opinion, that match was so good that I think at the end of the night, that's what people were talking about. And I think that kind of struck a nerve with Bret, even though he goes out and has these two, 5-star clinic matches on the show for WrestleMania in New York.
Yeah, and see, this is where you and I part company, because I prefer the Bret and Owen match. It's just more my style of match. I prefer that type of wrestling. I think historically speaking, we can look back at WrestleMania 10, and we can absolutely agree that in terms of historical relevance and significance, the latter match trumps the two of the matches just for that reason. It was the first. It was something brand new that hadn't been seen before on a large scale like a WrestleMania. But I would argue very hard that the Bret and Owen match was better.
Absolutely. And you can make that argument because you have Owen Hart, you have Bret Hart. These guys are two of the best in the business. So I'm all for it. I think, like I said, Bret Hart, I could name a ton of matches that I think he stole the show, whether it's the 1, 2, 3 Kid, Big Daddy Cool, but yeah, Owen Hart. But here we get to Shawn Michaels, though, in Vince McMahon's eyes. Like you mentioned earlier, he's skipping the line, going to the front. You have Bret into the night as champion, but you also have this cocky, flamboyant bad boy and HBK at 10. And this kind of cements himself in Vince's eyes that, hey, we might have another, world heavyweight champion here on the run.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. I don't know at this point in 94 if Shawn, or rather if Vince saw Shawn as the number one guy. I think we're a little ways away from that still. I think that you're right. There was a lot of stops and starts with Bret's title reigns, and then we kind of established Bret correctly now at WrestleMania 10.
Right.
Now we're on the right trajectory. He wins the championship at WrestleMania 10, and even Vince McMahon himself said, you're witnessing the blast off of the next generation of the WWF, which is crowned by your champion, Bret Hart. And then, of course, we go into 94 with Bret feuding with his brother for the better part of the year, whereas Shawn was, kind of in limbo for a little while, and then goes on to start tagging with Diesel and winning the tag team championships. So I think that if you look at 94 as a whole, Bret was holding the mantle and keeping strong and steady with the championship, delivering consistent performances. Whereas I think after Shawn lost the Intercontinental Championship, he was a little bit in no man's land for a couple of months in 94.
Absolutely. And I think what it was, you see Shawn Michaels as this worker, but he's building the confidence, but you still have a stacked roster and Razor Ramon, Big Daddy Cool Diesel as his bodyguard. And this is still, we're just kind of seeing the trajectory change. You do have Bret Hart, though, as your world champ. And to me, he's still getting these matches that maybe out of wrestlers that you would expect more. So I think this is another part where we're past rock and wrestling. We're in 94. Tell me, this has got to be the shits of WWF, right? As far as talent?
Well, I think that you can find a lot of hidden gems. I mean, if you look at SummerSlam 94 with Bret and Owen in the cage, I mean, the thing I really appreciate about that cage match is it wasn't a bloody massacre. It was a technical wrestling match in the confines of a steel cage. I'll never forget that suplex off the top of the cage on Owen, which was breathtaking. And then, of course, with Shawn as well, he was putting on performances that were at an extremely high level as well. But I do agree with you that in terms of the roster, it was spread a little bit thin. And this is really where we start seeing the gimmick wrestlers turn into overdrive. We had the Duke the Dumpster Drosies, and we had the Mantars and things of that nature. So I think in 94, they were trying something different, which was really appealing to a certain portion of the audience, mainly children. And it watered down the realism that the product needed. Hence, the Attitude Era a couple of years later.
So then we add a layer to, we peel off another layer of the onion. We're at Survivor Series, literally November. So WrestleMania, we're talking maybe, 4 or 5 months away. We see a submission match with Bret Hart and he loses the title. Granted, it's the throw the towel in by Owens' mom, or Bret and Owens' mom, but you get the crossface chicken wing applied to Bret Hart, and you've got Bob Backlund beating Bret Hart for the championship. What's up with that?
Yeah, I think it made sense if you look at it in the sense that they wanted to keep Bret whole, and they wanted to have Diesel go over as the champion. You know, I think it was 3 or 4 days time later, Diesel would win the championship over Bob Backlund in Madison Square Garden. And I think about 9 seconds, it was just straight into a jackknife, and that was it. So they wanted to go with Diesel, and that was the next trajectory. That was the next champion that Vince saw that could carry the load. And for Bret to lose in the manner that he did, it didn't really hurt Bret in that sense, the same way that it would had he done a clean job to Diesel at that time.
But you have Bret Hart, you know, you go from world champion to work in matches, you know, with Hakushi, with Isaac Yankem DDS, who's Kane, Jean-Pierre Lafayette. Wait. All these different, like, where are we at with Bret Hart? Like, how do you go from the world title to Diesel? Like, we just mentioned this roster. You see Diesel working. Luckily, you got to work with, like, Bulldog and Shawn, but you're working with, like, Mabel, dude. Like, how is this? What makes sense about this in 95?
Yeah, I think 95, for me, I mean, there are moments for both guys, but I don't think for either Shawn or Bret, I don't think that 95 was a particularly good year. I mean, I can pick out, for example, one of my favorite Bret Hart matches is his Survivor Series 95 match with Diesel, and it's for sure Diesel's greatest match ever. And then, of course, you had with Shawn, you had him win the Royal Rumble in 95. You had him have that incredible match with Jeff Jarrett at In Your House 2 in Nashville, Tennessee. So you had a couple of, glimpses of greatness there. Even when Shawn was teaming with Diesel, two dudes with attitudes, main eventing In Your House triple threat, that was a good match. But other than that, I mean, I can't really think of that many moments in 95 where either guy was particularly, tearing it down. I mean, they're having good matches, but they just weren't positioned to where they would be a year or so later.
Absolutely. And that's where we kind of see 96. It still feels like a down year, but these guys have elevated themselves. And then you start getting this other group of talent that kind of paves the way for the Attitude Era with Mankind, with Steve Austin, Triple H, just these other wrestlers. But you get Shawn Michaels winning that, Royal Rumble in 95. So now he is on the trajectory to be in the world title match against Diesel. And this is the night that HBK became a face. He's working heel, but he's, playing the part of a face in this match. And this is more backstage animosity where Bret's been on point to say that, he blames HBK for working as a face and breaking the code. Whether it's kayfabe or whatnot, Shawn Michaels did what he wanted to do. We've kind of seen that trajectory as we keep on going, whether it was the IC title or being in the main event at WrestleMania. He's there to steal the show regardless.
Yeah, I'm not so sure if I would say that Shawn was working as a face during the match with Diesel at WrestleMania 11. I think what really happened was, in my mind, I could be wrong, was that they decided to turn Shawn face the following night on Raw when Sid gave him 5 power bombs after he was given the night off, effectively firing him from his bodyguard duties. I think that's really where the face turn came. And then, of course, when Shawn returned after his, kayfabe injury, then he was sort of established as a face, and they started trying to get him over to the crowd as a face. And it really didn't take long for the crowd to gravitate to him in that way. And these were the first signs of attitude, I think, from Shawn, because he was a face, but at the same time, he still had that heelish edge.
Let's go ahead and kind of talk Bret Hart. Let's kind of talk Shawn Michaels here, because we're about to get to where their feud really picks up. So looking at two different wrestlers, this is clashes of styles, right? You've got Bret Hart, the technical wrestler, and you've got Shawn Michaels that, he's basically all over the place with, high spots, with selling moves, with trying to steal as much. It was almost like he treated wrestling like a TV show. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I think the thing that you'll find about these two guys is they can both do each other's move sets to somewhat of a degree. I mean, obviously Sean's bread and butter was being, Lucha Libre-esque before Lucha Libre was really a big thing in North America, or certainly in the US on national television. And Sean, or rather Brett, was obviously the ground and pound, scientific, technical wrestler who had innate toughness. But Brett could high fly if called upon, and Sean could work technically if called upon. So they had some similarities in terms of their move sets and their abilities, but obviously their bread and butter was quite different.
Right. And you see kind of Bret Hart as that old school, he's his character on screen and off, but he understands the audience, the fans. You're there for the fans. You've got a moral code to abide by. And he just seemed like he was on screen or off. He was the face of the WWF by his character.
Yeah, I think it's been pretty well established that Brett took his status and his celebrity very seriously. He wanted to be a role model for children. He wanted to be a role model that the type of character that your parents would be comfortable you watching on a Saturday morning with your breakfast cereal. I think that in Brett's MO, and whereas with Sean, I don't think that he was necessarily a bad influence at this point. I mean, he wasn't acting as a degenerate here in '96, but
he's got those flamboyant tendencies. He's kind of. Sure he's showing. He's even from his early IC run. Maybe it's just we didn't see much of Bret Hart as a heel, but Shawn Michaels has lived that heel gimmick to where he's used to doing whatever it takes to get over. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, I think that if you look at even, the histrionics and the characteristics of Shawn Michaels, the stripping in the ring and all that kind of thing, pretending to pull his trunks down to celebrate a match and things like that. I mean, it's not something that is, breaking the rules or necessarily something that's offensive. I wouldn't say. I certainly didn't see it that way when I was watching. But I could understand why some parents might, raise an eyebrow and think, what's going on here? Why is this guy doing this stuff?
Right. It's just at the time, it's weird. You know what I mean? We're not as comfortable with everything as we are, as we've talked, previously about Goldust and different characters, but we're on the trajectory. Shawn Michaels is winning the Royal Rumble. He's a face now. You've had Bret Hart, who's put in the classics with Diesel, with these other guys. He can work with anybody, like I said. But we're getting set up for the Iron Man match. And you have Hart, who is your champion, has been working nonstop, putting in a grueling schedule. You have HBK coming off, basically that fall didn't work a lot because of the, I guess the fight with the Marines in Manhattan, and then kind of selling that concussion issue. So it's got to be to Hart, knowing you're about to lose to Shawn Michaels. When you see the schedule you've put on and you've seen Shawn he's kind of the apple of Vince's eye now. You can kind of see that Vince is leaning towards, if you watch TV and you see the interviews Shawn Michaels doing with Vince McMahon, you can tell Vince McMahon's just almost over infatuated with Heartbreak Kid at this time.
Yeah, I think it's very clear that this is the direction that we're going. And I think Brett stated as well that he felt that way. He knew that that's where we were going, and he had no problem with it. But I think that his issue was maybe that at this point, he felt like, to your point, he was constantly putting on these clinics and running this incredibly difficult schedule, going from continent to continent and wrestling consistently, whereas Shawn had time off to train and to get into the best shape of his life. And he sort of felt like maybe he being Brett, that maybe he was a bit of an afterthought here, that, it was a foregone conclusion that Shawn's winning the title. So at this point, it's like, okay, you hold on to this until Shawn's ready to grab it. And then at WrestleMania 12, March 31st, 1996, at the Iron Man match, we're going to go ahead and have Shawn, we're going to pull the trigger on Shawn and Brett. Yeah, we know you're taking time off, so thanks so much. We'll see you down the road.
Terrible. I feel for Brett up to this point because you've had to deal with Hogan. You've had to deal with the start sit. You know, you don't really realize this when you think, oh, Brett's just a bitter old man. But this is a guy who ate, sleep, breathed wrestling. And you've seen him he's been the main guy. He should have been. But the way he's kind of been jerked around here for the last 3 or 4 years, even though he's still on top, it makes you kind of scratch your head, doesn't it?
It does. And I don't really agree with the narrative that Brett's a bitter old man. I think a lot of people think that he has a lot of bitterness towards, certain people and certain aspects of his career. But I think a lot of the times when he's quoted as saying certain things, I think that they're taken out of context. And I mean, to me, I think that he has a wonderful perspective on his career. Of course, there's going to be guys that he has some animosity towards, maybe not quite as strongly as he once did. But I mean, I think that's part and parcel with that type of business. We talked briefly, you and I, about having to be a little bit self-centered, and to get to the top of the wrestling business, especially in this time frame, you had to be self-centered. Otherwise, you'd get eaten alive. You had to think of yourself first.
Let's talk this Iron Man match, man, because this is 96. Me and you were just really hitting our peak as wrestling, kids. We're in our fandom here. How old are you, Jay, at this point?
I was 12.
You're 12. This is 96, so I would have been right at 11. So we're both right around the same age, and we're kind of very involved in this storyline, in this buildup. You've got, you see the promos of Bret Hart running through the tundra, the frozen, of Calgary, and Shawn Michaels doing, upside down push-ups with Jose Lothario. But we're getting to this hour clinic. What did you think of this match? Because this is one of my favorites of all time.
Well, you don't want to forget either that they were competing for the World Wrestling Federation Championship.
Howard, is that you?
Yeah.
Howard Finkel, ladies and gentlemen, on Raw.
On Raw. Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, you know what? I still look at this match as an absolute classic. I think a lot of people have now in hindsight kind of looked at it as, yes, it deserves its place in history, but it's not a top match. It's a little slow. It's a little plodding. Some people say that, it's hard to get invested in an Iron Man match because it's an hour time limit. So for me, I still look at it as a tremendous showcase of both men's abilities. To go an hour alone is just an incredible feat for both guys. And it's the type of wrestling that I really enjoy. So while I do agree that maybe there could have been a little bit more of a fast-paced stop and start in certain points of the match, there's really not a lot I would do to change it. The only thing that maybe I would have changed was not determining it as an Iron Man match, not classifying it as that match, and then maybe just having a one-on-one and have it go an hour. Ooh. So you have that suspense all throughout the match as opposed to knowing that it's going to go the hour.
Something so small could have meant so much. If you go back, I will probably say January, February, March of 1996 are my 3 favorite months, 3 favorite pay-per-views in WWF wrestling, because you get that you're getting the turning of the guard, but you're getting where you still have Razor and Diesel. You have 1, 2, 3 Kid involved. You have Goldust. You have, these other characters that are kind of establishing themselves. It's like a, passing each other walking out the door moment to me.
Yeah, it's a great era. I mean, you have to remember too, you had some new faces. You had a Vader on the company now.
Oh.
You had a returning Jake the Snake Roberts. You had an Ahmed Johnson. You had Bulldog and Owen. It was really a tremendous time in the company. There was so much talent on that roster. And if you look at the people that were on that roster, specifically around WrestleMania 12, look where they end up during the Attitude Era, how big of a stars they all became. I think WrestleMania 12 might be the only WrestleMania that every match has a Hall of Famer in it. I could be mistaken in that.
Well, that's the thing. You're getting like Savio Vega versus the Ringmaster Steve Austin, and they're tearing the show down, or tearing So many good matches.
I
So
love
let's get to the end of this match. It's a draw because Shawn doesn't tap to the sharpshooter as time expires. Time limit draw, but Gorilla Monsoon, acting, president of the WWF at the time, says the match must continue. Bret looks shocked. They come in the ring, wrestle for a couple minutes. Shawn Michaels hits him with the sweet chin music. That's all she wrote. Boyhood dream has came true for Shawn Michaels. But you see, whether it's storyline or not, you see, Hart's leaving here. He almost looks angry. And that maybe do you think there is a chance that Shawn Michaels maybe said, get the fuck out of my ring? Something along those lines, that maybe this was the start of maybe the disrespect that Hart felt towards HBK?
Well, I mean, I did do some research for this show, and in doing research, I went back and watched the Rivalry's interview with Jim Ross, Shawn Michaels, and Bret Hart done back in 2011, I believe. And they talked about that very moment, and I think they both came to the understanding that it wasn't necessarily a sign of disrespect to Bret. It was more along the lines of, we're going off the air with pay-per-view soon. Like, tell them to get the fuck out so I can do my celebration. And that was sort of more, it was more just to tell him to kind of get out of here so we could get off the air than it was a sign of disrespect at this point.
Yeah. But I mean, we've seen Bret Hart get disrespected for, in my opinion, 4 or 5 years right now. So I wouldn't hold it against him if he saw it as Shawn Michaels just being a dick.
Well, I think they both had the realization that they wanted to work towards a return. And so, the scuttlebutt backstage the night after WrestleMania 12 on Raw was that there was legitimate heat between the two. And
storyline or not.
Yeah. And Bret was saying, like, that's great. That's the greatest thing ever. Like, let them think that. Keep that going, because it's just going to do nothing but enhance the return whenever it does happen.
So Hart leaves. Lonesome Dove. Have you ever seen Lonesome Dove? I don't think I have.
I have. I think I've seen 1 or 2 episodes here and there.
Nothing to brag home about, huh?
No, I don't. I don't recall them offhand.
So we've got Shawn Michaels finally has what he wanted, the world title. But you have Hall and Nash heading to WCW, and everybody's changing the fucking channel. What's this got to do for HBK's, mindset, who's already a little unstable from his personality or his demons outside the ring? But now you finally got the spotlight, and everybody's flipping the channel to watch WCW.
Well, I think at this point, there was so much momentum going towards WCW, especially with the defection of Hall and Nash, that there really wasn't much the WWF could do. I mean, to change to turn the tide. They were putting on a program that was a little passe. Again, we're still in the era where we have a lot of occupational gimmicks. We have the TL Hoppers and the Who's and the Salvatore Sinceres, which, is great in theory if you're going to use them as, pseudo enhancement talent. But at the same time, I think that if you look
people
at Shawn's,
man.
What's that?
I said, I think people were over it by 96.
I think so too.
3 years of having to deal with, the Goon or the Repo Man or these 1 or 2's okay. But yeah, I mean, we've seen or what do they call them? Gimmick wrestlers like Adam Rose of the Rosebuds or Eugene or these, kind of characters, but it can't be in every other match, right?
No, not at all. And I mean, when you're main eventing Raw with The Undertaker versus Salvatore Sincere, and of course, on the other channel, you have the formation of the NWO. You have Scott Hall coming down and as an invader, or so we were led to believe as viewers. I mean, it was just a more mature product. It was something that was more gravitating towards the culture at a time. Popular culture as a whole was kind of resonating with a more mature, kind of realistic, irreverent kind of headspace. So with WCW mimicking that, they had the jump on WWF, and you can't go back and look at this time frame without talking about Shawn's run as champion. I mean, he had some absolutely outstanding matches. I don't think any of his matches in that first title run were under-delivered. I thought that they were all outstanding.
Well, let's talk about them because we do have Bret Hart on his hiatus, and we did talk about his kind of run. So Shawn Michaels is the belle of the ball at this time. Right out the bat, he's getting force-fed Big Daddy Cool Diesel, his best friend, good friends, better enemies at the next In Your House. And I thought they tore the house down.
Oh, 100% they did. And I think that this would be the only match I can think of with Diesel in terms of his WWF run that would rival that Survivor Series match from the November previous with Bret. These two matches together were Diesel's best performances without question. I
wish you would have gotten to see more of Diesel when he was coming. He felt like he was finally getting that edge, that January, February, March run where he was kind of turning heel, whether it was flipping off the camera or just kind of being, kind of cocky. And I think if we would have maybe seen that a year earlier, what it could have done for Diesel, I don't know if we would have positioned a bad guy to be a champ for a year straight, at least in Vince McMahon's promotion at the time. But I think that was a hell of a cool gimmick for Diesel as he was heading out.
Yeah, it almost had shades of what Steve Austin would become later on, right?
Absolutely. And then we get Vader. We were just talking, January, you have Vader enter the conversation, and you've got Raw where he's literally Vader bombing the commissioner or whatnot at the time, Gorilla Monsoon. So he comes off with Cornette right out the gate, just firing on all cylinders. And you get get quite the match with him and Shawn at SummerSlam.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so we went from Diesel at Good Friends, Better Enemies. Then we got the Bulldog twice at In Your House, Beware a Dog.
That's right.
As well as King of the Ring. We got a 6-man tag with Camp Cornette, Vader, Owen Hart, and the British Bulldog going up against.
Incident. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Ahmed Johnson, Shawn Michaels, and Psycho Sid. And then, of course, yes, we fast forward to SummerSlam with Vader. And this is what I loved about this time frame, Maddie, was it was still at that point where we were building up challengers for SummerSlam. We were building up, Vader had momentum all throughout 96 and finally becomes the number one contender in August of 96.
Man. Telling a story. And that's what they did. Like, we don't see that nowadays where you have a 3 to 4 month, build. It's all right here, right now, or next week,
Yeah, and we were also at a point where we weren't giving away pay-per-view matches on a weekly basis. I mean, we had to wait to see this Shawn Vader match. I mean, we built up to it. The seeds were planted there at the end of the King of the Ring of 1996. And then, of course, we had the 6-man tag in July at International Incident. Then we finally get to Vader and Shawn at SummerSlam. So we had to build our anticipation for months to get this match.
Absolutely. What were your thoughts on Bulldog in the main event? Like, as in 96, because you see him with Owen, and they're just, butter on a biscuit. They're just perfect together. And then you kind of have, Bulldog elevated to this main event, and you see the whole Diana Smith, Shawn Michaels, rumor and innuendo, either it's sexual harassment or whatever. I guess just kind of playing off that sexy boy character that Shawn had. What did you think of Bulldog here being in the main event?
I thought it was good. I thought it was a good way to showcase Shawn against different competitors. So you had, against Diesel, and you got to see a harder edge with Shawn right out of the gate. You'd just seen this 60-minute Iron Man match with Bret. And then you go into this no-holds-barred match to showcase some toughness on the part of HBK, some physical toughness with the weapons and going through tables and things of that nature. And then you're going up against the Bulldog, who's an established powerhouse. So you're going up and having a back-to-back with him, the better of the two matches being King of the Ring, in my opinion. And then you go on to, again, a different type of competitor altogether with Vader, who was just, quote, a mastodon.
It's time. It's Vader. Time. Anyways, and then we're Vader. They have a pretty good match. That's kind of what you want. Is this littler baby face who's having to work against the mastodon. And then it goes, I believe from there we're at Mankind at In Your House, right?
Yeah, Mankind at In Your House. Yeah, absolutely. And that's still to this day one of Shawn's greatest matches in his career, in my mind.
And see, to me, I love this. Maybe, like I said, it's my old schoolness, but I love seeing Shawn as champion and working, because to me, this is when I'm like, dude, this guy is on another level. Doesn't matter who he's working with. You know, some of his signature moves where he gets knocked over the top rope or whatever and he kips back up, you know, all these different things. You can tell he's kind of finding his own character as well in this 95, 96, where he's really hitting strides as well.
Yeah, and we're watching it as kids, Matty, you and I. We're watching it
Yeah.
as kids. I was 12 or maybe 13 at this point. You were 11 or 12, depending on when your birthday is. And we're watching this, and, you know, you're invested. You don't know if Shawn's going to win the title. Is he going to retain? Can he go over Mankind? Can he beat this force who is, you know, for all intents and purposes, you know, run roughshod over the Undertaker? The Undertaker, who was a force of his own at this time.
Absolutely.
So,
And
I mean, you were completely captivated as a child because you didn't know what was going to happen.
And it's kind of weird as you watch this kind of 90, 94, 95, 96 era. You don't really see The Undertaker involved with Bret Hart or Shawn Michaels at all.
Well, we saw him face Bret at Royal Rumble 96, which you said was one of your favorites, which was a pretty good match.
That's right. I'm sorry. Excuse me.
But I mean, to your point, we didn't see a ton of interaction. In fact, Shawn and Undertaker didn't have their first match on television until the fall of 1997 at In Your House Ground Zero. So you're right. The Undertaker was doing his own thing, and of course, at this point, embroiled with a feud with Mankind.
Right.
And then, of course, Shawn had the following month off at In Your House Buried Alive, as The Undertaker and Mankind had their Buried Alive match. Sid and the man they call Vader had a number one contenders match with Sid, which Sid won. And then we get to Survivor Series 1996, which for me is my favorite of Shawn's matches of his first title run.
Well, not only that, but we've got Bret Hart back in the fold, right? Lonesome Dumb's over with. He's in contract negotiations. He's coming in on a 20-year deal with WWE, and he's getting put right in a feud with Stone Cold, the badass, the new kitty cat's meow, as they would say.
Yep, exactly. And I mean, you couldn't have put Bret with a better opponent for his return. And of course, Shawn at this point lost the title to Sid. Again, for anybody who hasn't seen that Shawn Sid match, I know there's a lot of Sid detractors out there, but I dare you to find me a better Sid match than that one with Shawn in Madison Square Garden. It was just phenomenal. The heat alone in that match from the crowd made that match.
Absolutely. The Garden. And just to see, Sid cheered, like it was cool to see. And then I'm sure as Shawn Michaels, he probably didn't know how to handle that, because he is this white meat baby face who really is a heel in real life, but you're basically getting booed because they don't believe your character.
Well, and at this point, I think that this was one of those moments that we alluded to earlier with Shawn, where he was starting to kind of work a bit of a heel style almost in this match, because you could tell that the crowd had turned on him at MSG. So he was working while he was, like you said, white meat babyface at this time. He had some heel-like tendencies in this match.
Absolutely. And what about Bret Hart here? Picking up where he left off, but going into a feud with Austin, where he basically, this is kind of the precursor to WrestleMania, which we'll get to in a minute. But holy hell, Survivor Series, not only do you get Sid and HBK and a classic, but you get Hart and Austin with the build-up and everything. This had to be more than live up to the hype.
Oh, 100%. This match, considering as well that Bret hadn't really wrestled much in 1996, for him to come back and put on that kind of performance, I've long since stipulated that I believe that the night the Attitude Era was born was 1996 Survivor Series. I think that this is the night where it really was the big bang, if you believe in that particular theory. This is when that particular era began, was on this night.
So we got HBK, Bret Hart, both in the fold, both in that kind of heavyweight range where they've elevated themselves to both to the world title picture. And we're on our way to the Rumble. Obviously, December, it's one of those months where Shawn doesn't wrestle, but are we getting WrestleMania 13 rematch? At this point, that looks like the possible outcome, right?
That's where we're headed, it looks like. I mean, you have Brett challenging Sid for the championship at In Your House It's Time in West Palm Beach, Florida. And then from there, you go on to the Royal Rumble where, Sid wins over Brett, and actually Shawn cost Brett the match. You have Sid go over and go to the Alamo Dome in 1997 at the Royal Rumble, and he's facing the hometown boy, the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels. Shawn Michaels wins the match. Bret Hart gets screwed over by Steve Austin in the Royal Rumble match. And now the table seems to be set for Shawn having the championship back going into 1997. And it feels like we're going to see Bret and Shawn, the rematch, back to back from 12.
And that's where things just get really weird, I think, in this feud, is you see Shawn with the knee injury. Whether it's fake or not, the trajectory changes quite a bit, because you do get this WrestleMania match with Stone Cold with Bret. That's probably, I'd say, top 3-4 matches of all time, just as far as, telling a story, whatnot. But Shawn Michaels vacates the title, and the rumor and innuendo is that he did not want to put over Bret at WrestleMania 13. How much of that do you think is true?
It's really hard, right? Because from a fan's perspective, it's sometimes from our perspective as hardcore WWF fans, especially at this time, it's really hard to separate fact from fiction. And there's so many contrary opinions. There's so much news. There's so many different ideas that, people within the business, people like ourselves who are out of the business have formulated. So I can't say to any degree of certainty whether or not that was the case. I have my suspicions that maybe Shawn wasn't too eager to wrestle Bret again at WrestleMania 13, with the assumption in my mind that Bret would go over. But I mean, what do you think, Matty? Where do you land on that? Do you think that Shawn was just hot dogging it so that he didn't have to drop the title to Bret? Or do you think that he was legitimately hurt?
It's so tough, dude, because the way Shawn Michaels is he could have been hurt, but then he could have been, you see that, what is it? Just a few weeks later, a few months later, he's doing a backflip off the top rope. Things to just kind of that cocky asshole personality to either shove it to Bret Hart or whatever. But it leads you to think that maybe there's something there. But in the meantime, whether it's Bret Hart or Shawn Michaels, you have Stone Cold, who's elevating himself into that same picture because of Shawn Michaels not wrestling at WrestleMania 13, being just on the announce table. Dude, you've got Stone Cold becoming a made man and quite possibly more over than Bret Hart or Shawn Michaels by the end of the night at WrestleMania 13.
I think there's an argument to be made there for sure. I don't know if at that point he was necessarily at that level. He was certainly on his way. I mean, it was fortuitous for Bret that this happened, because ultimately he ends up going into this match with Steve Austin, and it becomes, in many people's minds, the greatest match in WrestleMania history, mine included. I mean, it's probably tied with Shawn and Undertaker from WrestleMania 25. Those would be the two that I'd point to as the greatest of all time. But if you look at this match, I mean, again, we talked about it earlier, telling the story, creating that, painting that portrait in the ring, which Bret was so excellent at. He excellently executed that particular match at WrestleMania 13 with Steve. And without question, without that match, I don't know if Steve would have gotten to where he was going as quickly as he did.
Absolutely. So when do you think this back and forth? I remember we watched that Toronto episode of Raw together, and it had already started. Was that pre-WrestleMania 13?
Yeah, that was in January of 1996.
So yeah, the bad blood's already formed, whether it's storyline or not. Like, you're seeing all these hints drop that these guys just really don't like each other. And a lot of the time, they're crossing the line.
Well, I think at this point, alluding to that documentary I watched to do some research here, I think both men kind of acknowledged that they were both trying to just play the characters of Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels and kind of emphasize their distaste for one another. But at a certain point, they started working themselves into a shoot where they started to take things personally, and then the shots became personal. And at this point, right around after WrestleMania, we see the reformation of the Hart Foundation with Owen Hart and the British Bulldog. And then, of course, subsequently, we would get Brian Pillman and Jim the Anvil Neidhart. Shawn Michaels is still off at this point, but on Raw. Bret has a knee injury, which he has surgery for. So he's doing a lot of promo work on Raw, and a lot of it with Shawn as well. And you can really see the real bitter anger and complete, I don't even know what the word would be, just venom they have for each other at this point. A lot of it, obviously, I think was performance-based, but there was a lot of reality mixed into that as well, I think.
Well, and so much so that you see that Sunny Days comment finally come out, where we're not a dating show, but getting back into the whole HBK and Sunny had their relationship. And, Bret Hart was really good friends with Sunny. You can believe what you want, but the Sunny Days comment was made by HBK, which stepped over the line. I mean, that's when you're talking about somebody who's got a wife and kids, and you're just randomly name dropping that on live television. Shit's going to go down, right?
Oh, 100% it would have. It would have caused a lot of problems for Bret at home for sure. But I mean, from a personal perspective, I would have given my left arm to have a Sunny day at that point. I mean, I would have shaken my back for Sunny.
I'm sure gosh dang, son. I remember those. Do you remember those WWE magazines with Sunny? And then what was it? They'd open a pay-per-view and they'd have Sunny in a bathtub. Holy cow.
Yeah, I remember them fondly. I remember them often and fondly.
So the Sunny Days comment turns into a fight backstage, man. That's when you can tell, art's imitating life. It's past the point of no return, where these guys just literally just want to beat the shit out of each other.
Yes, absolutely. And then we get, of course, with all these different scenarios happening, these miscues, these various shoot promos, for the lack of a better term, worked shoot promos that were going on back and forth. The night after King of the Ring in 1997 in Hartford, Connecticut, we had a legitimate brawl between the two backstage before Raw went on the air. And of course, at that point, that's when Shawn took his ball and went home for a couple of months, or at least a month or so, citing unsafe working environment. And of course, Bret had the night off, but ultimately Bret got back on TV fairly quickly. He was hurtling towards the Canadian Stampede pay-per-view in the 10-man tag, which at one point I believe Shawn was supposed to be a part. And then we get to the summer of 97, which was All Things Canada versus US.
Well, I think that's kind of fun to see the summer of, like, so many seeds are planted. You see kind of the Undertaker, Shawn Michaels storyline being told. You see Stone Cold, who's been red hot, but you see the unfortunate, I believe that's the same time the incident happened at SummerSlam with Owen. Am I correct?
Yes, that absolutely happened at SummerSlam. It was August 3rd, 1997 in East Rutherford, New Jersey at the Continental Airlines Arena.
So we go from Stone Cold, who's looks like he's getting elevated to this main event spot, to now he's out with the injury. And you've got, Bret Hart, Taker at SummerSlam. By the way, you mentioned Canadian Stampede earlier. Stone Cold, the Road Warriors, Ken Shamrock, Goldust versus Brian Pillman, Bret Hart, the Anvil, Owen, and Davey. And I believe they had where Shawn Michaels came out on a Raw, if I'm correct. And it was him and Sid at the time with like the Road Warriors and Stone Cold or something. And they ended up changing it. And I remember as a kid, I was kind of like, even though that match, that event is one of the most talked about events of all time, I was kind of disappointed because you are looking forward to Sid and Shawn Michaels. And when you get like Goldust versus, the Hart Foundation, you're a little let down as a 11, 12-year-old.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, there was some guys in there that they kind of shoehorned in. I mean, Goldust at that point didn't make a ton of sense being in the match. That moment you're talking about and alluding to is actually Sid's last appearance in the WWF until he had that match with Heath Slater back in 2013.
Jeez. Man, what could have been with Sid too if he was just he was still in his prime at that point too.
Oh, 100%. And that's another guy, much like Kevin Nash or Diesel, where I think that he gets a bad rap. I think he's a much better worker when called upon than he's given credit. I mean, again, go back and watch that Survivor Series 96 match and tell me I'm wrong.
Absolutely, dude. 100% agree on Sid and Nash by just, what they were able to do with Hart or HBK. But we're there, man. We're getting towards this, this run, this screw job, as you say. You see the Hart Foundation, but you also see DX being formed. Kind of, you get the Shawn Michaels as your special referee at SummerSlam, Hart versus Undertaker. Of course, Bret Hart does the infamous spits in Shawn Michaels' face. Hart moves, Shawn Michaels hits Undertaker with the chair. But in the meantime, this is setting up for what's coming, with this attitude. Shawn Michaels turns on the fan the next night. So now you have a heel Bret Hart with the Hart Foundation. You have a heel Shawn Michaels with coming together the DX in the next couple weeks, and you have Stone Cold on the shelf.
Yeah, and I mean, just going back to that SummerSlam match, I mean, 97 is probably one of my favorite SummerSlams of all time. That main event with The Undertaker and Bret Hart was absolutely outstanding. Anybody listening to this I know I'm telling you to watch a lot of stuff, folks, but anybody going out and wanting to see a clinic, go and see that Bret Hart and Undertaker match at SummerSlam. Shawn is the referee. It was a phenomenal match.
Absolutely. So now we're kind of set in motion that we have two heels here, man. We have Bret Hart and the Hart Foundation, which have basically said America sucks. Like, the USA turned their back on them, and they don't give a shit about the USA, which I get. Like, you see what kind of crowd we're kind of turning into, but it's the point of no return. You've painted yourself, at least with the Hart Foundation, as a heel. But you have Shawn Michaels, who is a heel in real life, so he can play this character. And this is where me as a fan, as a kid, I'm like, oh, I can't stand Shawn Michaels now because he's cocky. He's this degenerate. And as a kid, I wasn't about Shawn Michaels as a bad guy. I was like, this guy never shuts up. I didn't gel with him as much as, hindsight 2020. It was amazing work.
Oh, 100%. And I mean, speaking of degenerates, I mean, you look a couple of weeks after SummerSlam 97 on Monday Night Raw, the main event, Raw's War, rather, we get to see the first time of the pairing of Shawn Michaels and Triple H as a tag team. This is before they became Degeneration X, and they would go up against the unlikely partnership of Mankind and The Undertaker, because each man had their own rivalry at this point. Obviously, The Undertaker with Shawn after the events of SummerSlam, and Triple H with Mankind through the course of the summer of 97. So you kind of get to see the foreshadowing of the formation of DX here as well, at the same time that the Hart Foundation and Bret Hart are continuing on their narrative of Canada versus the US. And Bret's next championship contender is a very unlikely one in the Patriot, Del Wilkes.
Oh my gosh. And that worked kind of well too. I think that was a perfect time to bring in, Del Wilkes. You're leading back into this feud. But what a great placeholder to have somebody that's, a real American. This is Kurt Angle before, we had that US gimmick, but Del Wilkes has been in the business forever at this point.
Yeah, and they had the same theme music. The Patriots theme music was Kurt Angle's theme music, so
Crazy.
It kind of went hand in hand. Yeah, I mean, I guess it made sense. I felt like maybe it was a little bit of a weak championship follow-up after SummerSlam. I mean, yeah, right. The Patriot had come in. He had some success. He had pinned Bret on Raw, I think, before SummerSlam, so I think that was the story. But very shortly thereafter, in fact, at the Bad Blood pay-per-view, we would see a flag match between Vader teaming up with the Patriot, going up against the Bulldog and Bret Hart. And in my opinion, I think maybe I would have rather have seen Vader versus Bret at In Your House Ground Zero rather than the Patriot.
That just doesn't feel right. Like you're teaming. I can't see Vader as a face ever.
Well, I can see him as a face when he's trying to defend the honor of the U.S. I mean, he was still kind of like a character babyface at that point. But I mean, at the same time, we fast forward to that Ground Zero pay-per-view. We're going to see the first meeting between Shawn and the Undertaker in a match that we had never seen on pay-per-view, let alone television. So, I mean, that was another match that was a little bit anticlimactic. I get that we're building towards Hell in the Cell, the first ever Hell in the Cell. But what do you remember about that match, that first match with Shawn and Undertaker?
Dude, I remember this trilogy of matches because you have this Bad Blood Royal Rumble. But to me, this is a different Shawn Michaels. Like you said, he's a heel again. And we haven't seen this since like 94, really. So we have a world champion, basically a main eventer now. And this guy, to me, the cockiness, everything, it just highlighted his character. And I think it made, him and Undertaker in the whole Ground Zero match and leading into the Bad Blood match, I loved every minute of this.
Yeah, it wasn't bad. It wasn't bad at all. I mean, it wasn't anything compared to what we see at Bad Blood. But shortly after Bad Blood, and the night for me that really cemented DX in terms of them being a faction was over in Manchester, England, for a pay-per-view called One Night Only. And we saw Shawn Michaels go up against the British Bulldog in the main event for the European Championship. And of course, the Bulldog being the home crowd favorite, ends up losing to Shawn after relentless interference on the part of Shawn, Hunter, and of course Rick Rude and China rather. And so we would see the formation of DX in really full form here, I think, at this particular pay-per-view.
So we're rolling into Montreal and Survivor Series, but at what point are we at that Vince decides I'm going to go with Shawn Austin, I'm not going with Hart anymore?
I think we're at the point. So after the event that I just spoke of that took place in Manchester, One Night Only, there was so much heat based on the dynamic between the newly formed DX and the Hart Foundation. And then the following Monday on Raw, which was the first Monday in Madison Square Garden, the first Monday Night Raw in Madison Square Garden, that was the day where Bret and Vince had a meeting, and Vince mentioned to Bret that he wasn't able to honor his contract and that he should start trying to see if he can get his WCW deal back. And that's where I think the rubber meets the road. I feel like this is the time where we really get into some uncomfortable situations backstage that really rear their ugly head on screen as well.
So if you're Bret Hart, what is your mindset now? Because you have, you are the world champion. You've kind of seen where Shawn Michaels' trajectory is heading and Stone Cold's trajectory. So obviously you're okay dropping the belt to Austin. I get it. But the 20-year deal is now vacant or pretty much done. You're able to go to WCW and get that big payday, but you have creative control. You're heading towards your hometown for Survivor Series, and you find out who you're wrestling and what's going to happen. Like, where are you at mentally if you're Bret Hart?
Well, I think that Bret was pretty hurt about the whole situation. I think that he signed that deal in good faith in 1996, thinking that he would be with the WWF forever. He said as much in a promo the night he returned in 96. And now we've come to an impasse where Vince doesn't have the finances or the resources to honor Bret's contract. So he's asking him to go and seek elsewhere his deal that he had been offered a year previous. I think at this point, Bret is maybe in a little bit of shock. It's a situation that kind of came out of nowhere. You just put the title on Bret at Survivor or at SummerSlam rather. and suddenly he is a non-factor in terms of the future of the company because
Right.
they can't honor his commitments.
So if you're Vince McMahon, like, what are your options here? Because you are going in, DX is red hot at this point, right? You have The Undertaker, who's, still a face, and you have Austin, who's also gaining, coming back from injury almost, and you're heading towards, the next WrestleMania, all that, obviously. But you've got Survivor Series here. You have Bret Hart's hometown, and he's got to face Shawn Michaels. If you're Vince McMahon, do you pivot to another competitor for Bret Hart, or do you have to have this match because of the animosity, the heat between HBK and Hart?
I think that this match has to happen. I think that when we see the outcome of Bad Blood in that historic Hell in a Cell match, the greatest Hell in a Cell match in history, in my opinion, the first.
Right.
We see that Shawn's the number one contender. The Undertaker's gone off to do things with Kane, the newly debuting Kane. And Bret is waiting in the wings with the championship. If you look at Bret's run after he wins the title at SummerSlam, it's really indicative of kind of his first title run. I mean, he really didn't have a lot to do. The company was focusing on Austin, focusing on Shawn, focusing on those characters more heavily than they were the Hart Foundation. And I feel like after we get past SummerSlam 97, the Hart Foundation almost becomes an afterthought in terms of the plans for the future of the company.
Well,
so it
I was
runs
just thinking my notes. The one thing I did write down, Vince chooses Hogan first, and then he chooses HBK. So Hart's just getting overlooked, even though he's pretty much the face from 92 to 97. He's their guy. But Vince McMahon's showing favoritism to these other guys.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at what ends up happening in history, I mean, Shawn ends up going over at Survivor Series, as we know. And then shortly thereafter, he's gone for 4 years. So in hindsight, does it make more sense to keep Bret and get more years out of Bret? I don't know. But I'm just saying that I think that if you look at the parallels in terms of his first run, Bret's first run, that is, that he wasn't properly established as the champion and then loses to Yoko. Now we have the same thing going on here. You have Bret win the championship from The Undertaker, and then he goes on to face the Patriot,
Right.
and then he's in a tag team match. It's ludicrous.
Right. So let's put you in fucking fantasy matchmaker. It's Survivor Series, dude. It's Canada. The guy's contract runs out that night. Obviously, creative controls part of the stipulation. What do you do? Because we all know the Montreal Screwjob, and we'll kind of, fill people in on what happened. Basically, they screwed Bret, and we can get into details. But let's go ahead and for Jay, for people that don't know what happened because of the creative control and everything, basically they were at a stagnant of what to do that night, correct?
Yeah, I think that they were at a creative impasse. There was a situation a few weeks before the Survivor Series when Bret found out he was working with Shawn in, I believe it was San Jose, California. He went backstage and spoke with Shawn before the show and let him know that he was going to be working with Shawn at the Survivor Series and wanted him to know that he was always going to be safe with him. Remember, they've had a lot of animosity. They had a backstage fight in Hartford in June, and let him know that I have no problem with putting the title on you, or dropping the title to you rather, and that I have no issues with that whatsoever. And Shawn turned around and said, I appreciate that, but I want you to know that I'm not willing to do the same for you. And that's really where this all stems from, is the lack of respect that Shawn showed Bret in that moment. And that was Bret's sticking point. There's been a lot of back and forth in terms of, he didn't want to lose in Canada. He didn't want to drop the title to Shawn clean. That wasn't the issue. It was the issue that Shawn showed such disrespect to Bret that he wanted Shawn to prove to him first that he had respect for him before he would drop the title. So that's really in a nutshell what it is.
Do you blame Shawn at this point, or do you think, he should have just been like, you know what, suck it up. You've only got to deal with this guy for another month. Whether you hate him or not, it's almost over.
I think it's really hard to say in hindsight, even now, 25 years later, for us to go back and Monday morning quarterback the whole thing. I mean, if you're in Shawn's position, do you call an audible and say, let's just do the match? Do you feel like you need to do the screw job? At the same point, you know, your boss is telling you this is what's happening. Maybe he's feeding you a narrative that isn't necessarily the truth about what's going on just to get what he wants in the ring that night. I don't know if you're Shawn at this point, if you really have a choice. But I will say that Bret Hart has said that he knows that had he ever been presented with that particular predicament, that he would never have done that to Shawn because he was one of the boys first.
All right, Jay, what do you do if you're Vince McMahon here? Because you've got to screw. What we find out is Vince screws Bret Hart out of the championship. He tells him it's a double DQ. Once Shawn locks on the sharpshooter, Hebner rings the bell. Vince tells him to ring the bell, and you have the Montreal Screwjob. Whether it was supposed to be a double DQ or not, whatever Bret thinks, do you blame Vince for doing this, or do you see where he had no choice?
No, I think I've always sided with the thinking that there was a way to get out of it. And I think that there were so many alternatives presented. I mean, one of the ideas, I think the working idea going into the night was that we were going to have a big, schmoz finish, a DQ finish for the match. And then maybe the following night on Raw, you have Bret drop the title to Shawn on Raw. And that would be a bigger audience for the title change anyway. I think that the other thing that to consider as well is, to my knowledge, Bret's contract didn't run out actually until sometime in December. The narrative has always been that it was Bret Hart's last night in the company. I think, from my understanding, that's actually not correct, that Bret still had some time on his contract. While he had fulfilled his dates and then some for the year, he was still under contract until into the early part of December. So I think there's a lot of different scenarios you could have done here. You could have done a different match maybe the following month at In Your House. I just think that this narrative that Vince was painted into a corner is a little bit convenient at this point.
Absolutely, dude. And this is the last we see of Bret Hart. He gets screwed, and he lets them know. He's tearing up stuff on stage, and then painting with his finger the WCW words, and goes backstage and, hits Vince McMahon with the hook, knocks his ass out. So Bret leaves with a basically an exclamation mark, if I'd say not.
He certainly did. And then, of course, you would see in the coming, or rather the following weeks after Survivor Series, how the WWF handled the situation. You had the Bret Screwed Bret interview with Vince. You, of course, had Shawn bring out a midget, or rather a little person. Sorry, excuse me if I offended anybody. A little person version of Bret. It was just in such bad taste. I think it was week after week of just denigrating Bret after the screw job as well. So I think rubbing salt in the wound certainly didn't help things either. And then, of course, as we alluded to, after this incident, Shawn would have a couple of matches, namely with Ken Shamrock and then with The Undertaker at the Royal Rumble. And then from there, we go on to Steve Austin at WrestleMania 14. And that's the last we see of Shawn in ring for 4 years.
Yeah. And then we can kind of, we'll pick back up some other time with Shawn Michaels' run, because like you said, it was magical. It's not what you expected when you were getting Shawn Michaels back after like pretty much a broken back. But Bret Hart here pivots to WCW. How do you feel about this run? Obviously, the whole Goldberg concussion thing ended somebody's career that what could have been with Bret Hart. But how do you take his WCW run?
I think it was lackluster, to say the least. I don't want to point fingers, because I don't buy the premise that Bret came into the company as like a broken toy or a shell of himself. I think that Bret was of the opinion that he wanted to shove it up Vince's ass, and he wanted to come in red hot and make a difference in that company and try to elevate that company, which I think he absolutely could have. But he was very quickly relegated to a position on the card that was, mid-card at best, which was so unfortunate. Even from a financial perspective, the amount of money they were paying him to face Disco Inferno and Conan on Monday Nitros and Thunders was, I don't know, a bit of a disconnect.
It almost seems like the early 90s with Hulk Hogan. Like, you leave, basically Hogan leaves, goes to WCW. Bret Hart goes there where he should be the top dog coming out of that Montreal Screwjob. He'd probably be their biggest baby face at the time. This is where you pivot him against Hogan, wherever your bad guy is, and yet they waste him.
Yeah, the fact that he didn't go in to that company and face Hogan within 3 or 4 months is mind-boggling to me. I understand you already have your storyline set in place, especially with Sting and Hogan at this point. You're paying it off at Starrcade 97, which was a year-long build, if not longer. But at that point, do we need to pivot to a rematch with Hogan and Sting at Super Brawl? I think maybe we do Hogan and Bret at Super Brawl. Doesn't need to be for the title. You can have Sting go up against Hall, Nash, whomever you like. But the fact that we had Bret come in, face Flair, which is a match we'd already seen, and then face Kurt Hennig the following month at Uncensored, which is a match we'd already seen.
Just seems like a waste.
Yeah. And then shortly thereafter, they turned him heel. So
yeah,
there's a lot of head scratching in terms of Bret Hart's booking in WCW. We can all agree on that. And but I think that is a story to get into at another time in great detail. It's too in depth a story, and there's too much meat on that bone to go into detail right now, I think.
Absolutely. Bret's WCW run and what could have been and what was with the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels, when he did find Christianity and he made his return in 2002, was great. But this was Bret Hart. This was Shawn Michaels. This was their rivalry. We talk Bret Hart or Shawn Michaels. End of the day, Jay, who you going with here? If you're looking at this WWF run from their tag team days till Bret Hart's exit and Shawn Michaels' back injury, who do you got to lean here?
I'm always going to lean Bret. I love Shawn as well. I was not a fan of the DX Shawn Michaels character. I wasn't a fan of DX in general. I think the way I've kind of drawn the parallel here is between the two of them. If you're a Batman fan, you can see the classic Batman with Michael Keaton and Jack Nicholson, and you see the Dark Knight with Heath Ledger and Christian Bale. Both films are absolutely spectacular, but they're too different to compare. But in some ways, they're too similar to compare. So I think you look at the same idea as Bret and Shawn, while they each complemented each other in terms of similarities and overlapping in some areas, I think that they're both so tremendous on their own that it's too hard to compare them.
Absolutely. It was almost like a yin-yang effect. These two together produced so much goodness, so much nostalgia, and basically made the WWF what it was post Rock and Wrestling, post Hulk Hogan. Basically, this was that void before you got to the Attitude Era. It was Shawn Michaels. It was Bret Hart. So I am more than grateful to talk rivalries with you anytime, Jay. Heartbreak Kid.
Who you got? Who's you? Now that you've asked me the question,
I got to go Shawn, man. I still think, what he brought to the stage and how he was able to win Vince McMahon over. What he did, he was the first of his kind to be that cockiness, just do, like you said, skipping the line at the beginning of the show with Hogan and Savage. I'm not waiting in line. He did whatever it took to get over. He was that flamboyant bad guy. And I think he was kind of set the pace for treating wrestling like a TV show. Like, it was all about him. where you did have Bret was a little bit more your lunch pail kind of guy. Whether you hated or loved or HBK, he stuck out. If I'm correct here, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's no denying Shawn's contributions to the business. And I mean, we're not going to touch on it now, but you can look at his run in 2002 to 2010. I think there's an argument to be made that that's the better run of the two. But
right.
I mean, both men stand on their own as pillars of that company. And I think that it's time that they're recognized on that Mount Rushmore more so than some of the other names that we see constantly referred to on that list.
Jay, let's get out of here. Last thing I'm going to ask you, I'll tell mine after, and we'll ride off into the sunset. If you're going to pick any Bret Hart match to watch throughout his run here, and any Shawn Michaels match outside of his run or during this run, what you got?
Oh, I've named a bunch already on this show. I think the way I'm feeling right now, I mean, it's got to be Bret and Austin at WrestleMania 13. Maybe Perfect and Bret at King of the Ring 93. For Shawn, of course, if we're not talking about this run specifically, it's going to be Undertaker and Shawn at WrestleMania 25. If we're talking about this run, I got to go with Bad Blood in your house, the Hell in the Cell with Undertaker. And one last thing I will say about the Montreal match is I think that the Montreal match probably is my favorite between the two, between Shawn and Bret. Up until the Screwjob, it was probably the most heated and most hard-hitting match of their series of matches.
Absolutely.
How about you, man?
I can dig it. For Bret Hart, man, the one that sticks out is that Roddy Piper match. It's his IC run, but I really think he elevated himself. The way Piper talks down to him and just the way that match plays out in the Hoosier Dome. One of my all-time favorites. Go back and watch Piper versus Hart. To me, and I'm going back to the IC title runs, I'm going Shawn Michaels versus Razor Ramon. Not the WrestleMania match, but the SummerSlam match of 95.
Yes.
Check it out.
Very good match. Very good match.
Yeah. Just a little under the radar. We talk about these world title runs. I figured I'd play it back with a little IC. The working man, baby. Dude, Jay, Maddie Daddy, let's get the truck out of here, dude.
Yeah, man. This was awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you, for listening to us and indulging our rivalry today. It didn't get too heated, but that's what it's all about. We're just a couple of wrestling fans shooting the breeze and talking the territory. We had a blast, and hopefully we can do it again soon, man.
Do, baby.
All right. You take care of yourself, man.
Absolutely. You as well, Jay. We'll get back on a rivalry a little bit down the road. See ya.
Thanks for joining us this week, Maddie Daddy. I had a blast. It was so much fun going back and looking at the history of these two guys. I can't wait to bring you some new content as well, ladies and gentlemen. We have a lot of fun things on tap. Don't forget to check out www.countout7.com. And in the meantime, until next time, once again, you've been listening to the Good Friends, Better Enemies podcast.